I'm Paul Segal. I'm a professor of economics at the IAE Business School in Argentina, and I'm the author of the core insight, "The Sky's the Limit, the Economics of Inflation and Hyperinflation." Inflation is a fact of life in capitalist economies. Low levels of inflation, around 2 to 5% per year, rarely bother us. But what happens when inflation gets out of control? In Argentina in 2022, inflation averaged nearly 6% per month, which compounded to nearly 100% over the year. And in presidential elections the following year, the candidate who won did so by promising to do whatever it took to bring inflation down, regardless of the costs. But there are also more severe cases of countries suffering thousands of percent inflation in a year. And when a country sustains inflation over 50% per month, we call it hyperinflation. Money loses value so fast that people spend it as fast as they can or abandon the currency altogether. What explains high inflation, and how can it be stopped? At its heart, inflation reflects a simple fact. Holding all else equal, economic agents would all like to increase the price they charge for their goods, their services, or their labour. But when one agent increases the price they charge, this implies an increase in costs for whoever pays them, their customer or their employer. And whoever is now facing higher costs wants to raise their own prices in turn. In macroeconomics, we learn that income equals expenditure because my spending is your income and your spending is my income. From the perspective of inflation, this means something else. My cost is your price and your cost is my price. We see this at work in different scenarios. In the wage price spiral, prices go up, workers negotiate a higher wage to compensate, and then firms raise prices again because high wages have raised their costs. It also occurs when a country faces a depreciation of their currency. Now imported goods become more expensive, so importing firms raise the prices they charge. If these firms also supply other firms, then the costs of those firms go up, so they want to raise their prices too. But rising prices in the economy often leads to another depreciation, and then further inflation, setting off a depreciation-inflation spiral. Economists and policymakers have a standard set of tools to combat inflation using demand management. Put simply, if inflation is too high, you raise interest rates or tighten fiscal policy in order to reduce aggregate demand. That creates a recession. It raises unemployment, which puts downward pressure on wages and cuts off any potential wage price spiral. A credible central bank can help to stabilize expectations of inflation because then economic agents build in low inflation to their contracts. For many countries with low levels of inflation, this is fairly effective. For countries with really high levels of inflation, the problem goes far beyond aggregate demand. In cases of hyperinflation, there's usually a combination of an unsustainable fiscal deficit and an ongoing depreciation-inflation spiral. But in these cases, the solution isn't a simple fiscal adjustment because the fiscal deficit is typically caused by something beyond the government's control, sometimes a conflict like a civil war, but most commonly it's caused by unsustainable foreign debt. This causes hyperinflation through two mechanisms. First, high debt payments imply a large fiscal deficit, and the fact that the government is already finding it hard to repay its debt means that no one will lend to them to cover the deficit, so they end up printing money. In this context, printing money means the government is adding to aggregate demand through spending without reducing it by borrowing from the private sector. So it's like a supercharged fiscal stimulus, right when inflation is already too high. And second, the government is desperately trying to buy foreign currency in order to pay the interest on the foreign debt, which means pushing up demand for foreign currency. That raises its price, which is the same thing as a depreciation, i.e. foreign currency gets more expensive relative to domestic currency. That then pushes up import prices, further feeding the depreciation-inflation spiral. Escaping these dynamics is hard. It typically requires not just fiscal and monetary tightening, but also exchange rate controls, convincing people that there's a change in the economic regime in order to change expectations of high inflation, and often debt restructuring to cut unsustainable debt repayments. Inflation is a complex problem involving aggregate demand, expectations, negotiations between economic agents, international trade, and international finance and debt, all interacting at once. Central banks in many countries make great efforts to keep inflation low because it is much less difficult and less costly to do that than to bring inflation down once it gets too high. But the challenge is greater for developing and emerging economies that are dependent on commodity exports because they have to contend not just with aggregate demand and expectations, but also with international prices that are highly fluctuating and with foreign debt. In this insight, we'll see why inflation behaves so differently across countries and why stopping it is ultimately as much about politics, institutions, and conflicts between winners and losers as it is about economics.